Welcome back, everyone. We're so grateful to have you here. We've got another great episode coming your way. Today, joining us is Dr. Jenni Back. She is a retired mathematics educator from the UK, and she is a consultant of teaching children ages 3 to 19. She's the co-author of this fantastic book that we just love. So you've got to check it out, Making Numbers. And then she also just let us know there's a great fractions book as well. So we'll make sure to link up to both of those so you can see the fantastic concrete examples that are inside of there. But she's worked on lots of different projects, and she's finding retirement to be difficult to settle into because she's so interested in so many things. Jenni, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Well, we are just thrilled to have you here. You've got such an interesting background, and it's kind of a roundabout way that we got there. I'm actually going to let Heather kind of describe how we stumbled into your work and ask you some questions about all the interesting things that you've been doing over the years.
Sure, thanks, Adrianne. So we started with our students, since we use a lot of dice patterns, we started making a frame to go with them. And it was working really well. And so we decided to look and see if anyone else was doing it. And as we did, and we followed the breadcrumbs, we found Jenni Back. And she had done some research in Hungary, observing students using this 10 frame and other types of things. And so we wanted to ask her questions about it today. So Jenni, if you could tell us, let's start a little bit just about manipulative usage in Hungary with what you observed. How do teachers in Hungary perceive manipulative usage?
They offer children a huge variety of manipulatives from the get-go. One thing that you have to bear in mind when you're thinking about the Hungarian system is that they don't start formal schooling until they're rising 7. And prior to that, all their experience is in preschool, which is very well structured with very well trained practitioners. And those practitioners do no symbolic representation, neither letters nor numbers. So, but they all give children huge amounts of pre-symbolic experience, both in language and in mathematics. It was mathematics that I looked at in detail, but I could see what else was going on with the language stuff. But with the mathematics, they're giving them lots of experience of counting. So they're using the number names verbally, and they're playing all sorts of number games and reciting rhymes in much the same way as we do with our preschool children in the UK. And I'm sure you do in the US as well. But they don't write anything down. They don't even write their names in preschool. They have a character and a stamp that they stamp on all their work. But they're doing massive amounts of fine motor skills development, gross motor skills development, identifying colours, identifying numbers and sets of numbers and the way in which they order, but nothing with any symbols.
Wow, that's really fascinating. That's very different from here. What were some of the key things that you observed in your research in Hungary? How did you feel like that start affected the students and the use of manipulatives?
Well, I followed a nursery class which took 3 to 6 year olds, so it was a mixed age class, and also a grade 1 class, which the children are 6 coming on 7, during the course of an academic year and a term. So I did 4 term visits following the same children, and visited them every half term. So I could see what the progression was, how they were getting on. The children got to know me, and although I couldn't talk to them in Hungarian, I had a translator with me who translated for me, and we videoed their lessons. So it was quite a it was only a snapshot. It was only one class, and one class in nursery as well, but it gave me a very good idea of the progression. I was working with one grade 1 teacher, highly skilled, experienced teacher, who was really good at following the program. And the lesson that stuck in my mind and I've written up and written articles about was the story of 6 lesson.
Mm.
So when I visited them in the second half of the autumn term, I was visiting the class and they had spent 1 week on each of the numbers, 0 to 5, and they were just moving on to 6. So they were introducing the idea of 6, the sixness of 6. Now we pay that lip service, but I don't think we really get the depth that they were showing in the work they did there. So during that course, the course of that lesson, which introduced number 6, I saw 10 different representations of 6. And the children then were in a position to generalize across those different representations. And they had experience with all the different manipulatives that were being used. So none of them were alien to them. And they could then build on their understanding of 5 and extend it to 6.
Mm.
Yeah, that's great. We find often that some of our older students have missed that step. And we really need to go back, like you said, and develop that sixness of 6. Sometimes people are just assuming the kids figure this out, and not all of them do. Were there any other things you learned there that you felt were helpful in your consulting, especially with intervention students?
Well, that they keep the class together. So there's a lot.
Level them. They keep them all on the same level.
They're all on the same level. And so to some extent, like that story of 6 lesson, there's a game they're playing. The children know more than they're showing in many ways, but they're all expected to do the same thing. And the lesson was very teacher-led. It was very teacher-led from the front, with amazing board work, a lot of hide and reveal stuff that was revealed gradually during the progress of the lesson, so that you ended up with this wonderful display on the board of things to do with 6. So that I found really interesting. It was in contrast to my experience working for Enrich, the online maths project based at Cambridge University, which does a lot of creative problem solving and sets tasks for children like that, for children to have a go at and get excited about. This was much more kind of step-by-step teaching, really, much more direct teaching. So the contrast to me was really interesting. And I think there are benefits to both approaches. And I suppose in some ways this fed into writing our book about manipulatives, because what we're saying there is there are step-by-steps here, but you can get at them through meaningful, rich tasks that children will enjoy.
That's fantastic. Yeah, we love that about your book. Let's talk about the Hungarian 10 frame a little more specifically.
Yes.
Maybe for those who aren't familiar, I'll just quickly describe what it looks like. So rather than a traditional 10 frame with 5 boxes on top and 5 on the bottom, instead it looks more like a domino of 5 and 5 with open slots so that you can put things in the slots to represent numbers. So now that we've established that for those who weren't familiar, can you tell us more about how you saw that being used and how it supported numeracy for students?
It is used very thoroughly, and there's a process where they use double-sided counters, and every child on their desk, one of the many manipulatives they had on their desk for this story of 6 lesson, was a domino 5, double 5 empty frame, and some counters that were the same size as the spots, blue on one side, red on the other, and just made of card and kept in a little box like a dice, so that the patterns on the outside of the little box were dice spots. And you can buy those in Hungarian supermarkets in September for sort of probably about less than $1, certainly less than $1. And every child had these on their desk, but they would also probably have had them at home because they're so cheap. So they would put the the counters on the 10 frame and fill up 6 slots. We're talking about 6, so let's stick to 6. So they'd fill up the 5 and then they'd see the extra 1. And that gave them a sense of the number being 1 more than 5, very strongly. Now, if you turned over those counters one at a time, you could see that 6 was 5 plus 1, or 4 plus 2, or 3 plus 3, or 2 plus 4, or 1 plus 5, or 6, nothing plus 6. And so you've got the composition of 6 is demonstrated with the counters, the 2 colours of counters. And for me, the strength of that double 5 domino 10 frame, the Hungarian number picture, which is what they call it in Hungary, they call it a number picture, is that it uses the human ability to subitize, because you can see that 5 very easily on the 2 rows of 5 frame. It's much harder to see the difference between 4 and 5 than it is on that double 5 pattern. And so it's using pattern, which is, we have an innate desire to look for pattern as human beings. It's using that pattern to help support the mathematics.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And we do find with the students that we work with that the traditional 10 frame, the students tend to count 1 by 1. They really just don't see the 5-ness of it, like you talked about. And so when we switched over to this Hungarian 10 frame with the domino pattern of the 2 5s, we found that kids were picking things up much faster because they can really see the number compositions and they can see the 5-ness and they can see how many more to 10. And it helps them retrieve their math facts too, especially some of our kids have dyslexia and they struggle with word retrieval. And we find they can retrieve the visuals sometimes easier than they can just the string of numbers. So it's been really helpful with our students.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very strong representation and underplayed.
Definitely.
One question I have. So Jenni, you're saying that you can find these in the supermarket, which just blows my mind. Like, that's amazing. I wish we could find more math here in those supermarkets. This readily available. So that says to me that this frame has probably been around in the Hungarian society for a long time. Do you have a sense of that by chance?
I had a sense of it, but I can't say I can say exactly where it came in. I'm afraid I don't have that historic data.
Okay.
But I a very strong sense that it's been around for a long time. Parents know it, children know it.
Yeah,
It's
that's
there.
really interesting. Really interesting. Okay,
And
I'll
I
let
think
Heather ask
actually,
the next question.
I'll just say one more thing though, because I think we have to bear in mind that there is a cultural difference. There's no doubt at all that Eastern Europe and the ex-Soviet bloc countries valued education in a way that the West doesn't, and that the social organization, which is about cooperation and working together and keeping the class together, probably springs to some extent from that, and may even now, I did this research 10, 12 years ago. I suspect that it's being diluted by the insidious creep of markets, etc.
Yes.
And so there is stuff that was there then that is to do with the cultural value ascribed to education, that I suspect we can't replicate in our societies. But it's still, the artifact is there and useful, and so we can use that even if we can't get our supermarket stocking maths kit, sadly.
Yes.
And we did find a link of someone who makes some nice wooden Hungarian 10 frames. And so maybe that's something we can link to in the notes. They're really beautiful, probably more expensive
Yes.
than ones you saw in the marketplace there, but just really beautiful, and the pieces have some nice weight to them.
Yeah, those are gorgeous. I worked with them on that. Is that Yellow Door?
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
I worked with them on some of their stuff. So
Yeah, those are beautiful. We love those.
gorgeous. I have some of those. My grandchildren play with them all the time, although they're 6 and 10, so they don't really need them, but they use them as cookies for baking
Oh, that's
and
cute.
playing cafes and stuff. So
Okay, so another resource that I saw you using at some points was Cuisenaire rods, but I
yeah.
also saw that you had some considerations about when to use those. So let's start out by explaining for people what they are, first of all. So how would you describe Cuisenaire rods?
These are coloured rods that were developed by Cuisenaire, who was a Belgian maths educator, to the best of my knowledge, and really pushed by another guy called Caleb Gatenio, who found them being used in a Belgian school and was so enamored of them that he developed their use further. They're proportional rods, in proportions 1 to 10. The smallest unit is a 1 centimeter cube, and then they get bigger and bigger. This is metric, obviously. This is European, so it was metric. And 1 centimeter cubes are quite nice, and you get these little rods, and you can make a staircase out of them from 1 to 10. They're different colors. They're interesting and particularly useful, in my opinion, because they work on proportionality, the way in which numbers are proportional to one another. So 2 of the little 1 centimeter cubes will make 1 red, which is the next step up, and 3 of those will make a lime green one, which is the next step up from there. They needn't necessarily be numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, although they are in those proportions. And I've seen them being used very effectively by expert teachers, admittedly, but comparing 2 different rods to one another, it might be a 2 and a 5, and say, 2.5 of the 2 rod makes 1 of the 5 rod. And so you've got ideas of the relationships between numbers coming into play there. And that I mean, they're very powerful in that you can introduce algebraic thinking to very young children like that. And they'll start saying things like 2 whites and 1 white and 2 reds make a yellow. And they'll say that, which is effectively algebraic reasoning. They won't be ascribing numbers to them, but they'll be counting the rods and comparing them.
Yes, we've seen them used really well in fraction and proportion lessons.
I think to introduce, then they are being, in Hungary, they were being introduced alongside all those other representations. The Cuisenaire rods was one of their representations and was used. And, and you can do them by feel. What's interesting is that if you get proficient at them, you can add fractions by holding rods behind your back and come up with answers without even looking at them. It's quite extraordinary. I do think that we don't do enough play-based free exploration with a lot of resources, so then the resource gets in the way of what's going on. I mean, I'll give you for instance, when I developed an activity that was about a geometric activity using a loop of string for the Enrich website, that's about making triangles and comparing triangles and making quadrilaterals and comparing them. And when I did that activity with teachers in training in the UK, I used to have to say to them, well, play Cat's Cradle for 10 minutes, because I know you won't listen to me until you've done that. Because there are things you naturally want to do with particular bits of kit that if somebody doesn't let you do it, it's going to get in the way of your thinking, certainly in the way of your mathematical thinking. So I say, let the children play with whatever it is you're going to use first, And they'll find some properties of those things while they're exploring it. It's not wasted time.
That's good advice, because sometimes I find teachers say, oh, the kids are playing with the manipulatives, so I just won't use them anymore. And so that them and then move on and say, okay, now it's time for the lesson. Now we're going to do a structured lesson about the sixness of this number. That allows you to have both the benefits, but also the kids have the chance to play. Okay, so Jenni, we saw an Enrich article that you wrote that talked about Cuisenaire rods and some considerations for using them because, for example, one rod of 6, it is still only one rod. So it doesn't have the same sense of having multiple units for some students until they've played with those Cuisenaire rods for quite a while and started to develop the relationships. So can you help us know what are some times where you might want to use a Hungarian 10 frame versus Cuisenaire rods?
Yeah, I think they both have their uses, and that's the critical thing. And it depends what you're drawing attention to, but it's really important to stress the connections all the time. So with the Cuisenaire rods, you can see 1 6 rod as being 2 3s or 3 6s, and that starts to take you down into how the 6 rod is composed of 6 of the 1 white cubes. So you begin to build that in and see the differences, but you are focusing on the proportionality rather than the counting of the different bits of it, if you like. Whereas on the Hungarian number picture, you're looking at the structure that you're focusing on. There is the 5, the closeness or distance from 5 all the time. So you're seeing numbers as multiples of 5 in many ways, which is also useful. And the traditional 10 frame or Numicon, which is another resource, draws attention to oddness and evenness. So it just, there are kind of horses for courses. There are some things that are better for different activities. And I think to encourage children to have a go with several things and then ask them what they think is best and what was most useful encourages them to discriminate and also to see that generality, because maths is big, the ideas are big, they're not specific to the kit that we use to help unpack them for the kids. So we have to bear in mind that the concepts that we're talking about are abstract, and that's what we're working towards, but the kit helps us to make sense of those.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I find sometimes teachers think they need to use every single manipulative they have to show every concept. But I think, like you said, sometimes it's important to think about which manipulative will highlight in a structured lesson what you're trying to bring across. And then you can broaden that further and have kids, think about some of the other manipulatives as well. But it doesn't always have to be that you have to teach every concept with every manipulative. We can more about the overall goal and be structured with it.
And I do think it's important to draw attention to the connections between these things, so that it's. I remember one really sad case where I was working with a student teacher, and she had taught 3 different methods for multiplication. And at the end of the day, the kids didn't know whether they were on their head or their heels, because they didn't see it as 3 ways of looking at the same thing. They saw it as 3 different things.
Right. And you've got to map all that information together.
Yeah. So they were seeing, I can't remember now the details of it, but say seeing scaling as being a totally different thing than successive addition, for instance.
Right.
Counting in groups.
Yeah, the kids need a chance to generalize that and understand this is a more abstract method of math. It's not particular to Cuisenaire rods or particular to any certain model. And sometimes I find that teachers will latch onto one manipulative that they think is the answer to math. And I see that with Cuisenaire rods, and there are some really good things we can teach about that. But then I sometimes find kids that can't transfer it. They think it's only about rods. So it's really important to do that transfer.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the idea of the number line is vitally important too. And the continuity of numbers, and the fact that numbers are not discrete, they're continuous measure of quantity as well. And that sense of building up that number line using bead strings or whatever is important. You don't get that very easily from Cuisenaire rods unless you line them up along a ruler or whatever.
Right. We agree. We find that often students don't know where the number line came from. And so having a chance to build cubes or a bead string and mark a number line and make a number line helps kids understand we're not just arbitrarily putting numbers here. These numbers represent quantities. So it's a really good tool. It's an important tool because they need
yes,
for later years for graphing. And so it's really
absolutely. Yeah. And the Making Fractions book builds that in very strongly. So that bridge between going from, you know, slices of a pie, for instance, to building a number line model of mixed numbers.
Well, that's cool. We know what we're buying next. We hadn't realized fractions book, so we're thrilled. Can you tell us about some of your other research that we haven't talked about so far? We've highlighted mostly that experience in Hungary, but is there anything else you'd like to share?
Well, the Hungarian project arose out of the work that I was involved in at Plymouth University, which was through the Centre for Innovation in Mathematics Teaching. And they had done a complete translation of the elementary up to grade 7 or 8 on your measurements in the US. Their math scheme, really, a math scheme. They had, at that time, they did it in 1999. So it's old stuff, but I found that really interesting to look at that. And I did do quite a lot of development work alongside that by working with teachers and how to use that in their classrooms. It was very teacher-led. The other piece of work that I did, which in a way tried to integrate the work that I did with Enrich, so rich tasks, meaningful problems as a way into understanding mathematics, linking that up with a Hungarian more teacher-led approach to direct teaching. I helped a school in Brighton over a period of 6 years develop a program of study based on the big ideas in mathematics, the big topics, and working on primarily on thinking and reasoning mathematically. But these kids, it was a quite economically deprived area with a lot of kids with both social and learning difficulties. But we had great success in doing this. So we used to work on 3-week blocks on particular topics. The whole school, it was a 1-form entry school, so quite a small school, would be working on the same topic at the same time so that teachers could talk to one another about what they were doing. And if there was any conversation about maths, which we tried to encourage across, in the playground and so on, that was, the kids were all talking about the same thing. And so we started off with, in the beginning of the autumn term, with something on number sense. We went on to do something on addition and subtraction, then did some work on geometric patterns and so on. And we built a year around that into these 12 sub units, 12 big ideas, all structured in a similar way. And I have written that up, actually. That's another book called Hooked on Mathematics that shows, and all those resources are free. So the CIMT resources linked with the Maths Enhancement Programme, which was the translation of these resources, are completely free to download, and they're interesting. They don't look very exciting, but they're interesting mathematically. and very well conceived.
Wow, that's fantastic. We'll definitely check those out. We're so excited to have found all these resources. Let's see. Do you want to tell us anything about your book, Making Numbers, and your fractions book, just so people have an idea, kind of what's in it and what they might like to see in it?
Yes.
Oh,
Okay, so in Making Numbers, we focused on using manipulatives to teach arithmetic to children from 3 to 11, 12. And we started off with little numbers and built up to bigger numbers. So there's a section on the numbers to 5, and then to 12, and then to 50, and then to 100 and beyond. Using a range of manipulatives, all practical. We've totally ignored virtual manipulatives in both books, deliberately, because that's another minefield, and the translation between the virtual and the concrete is another step for kids. But every single task in both books has been tried with children in school. It's not just, and there are a lot of our favourite activities, but it's not just Sue, Jenny and Rose's best bits. It is all tried with children and all based on sound research evidence. So for both projects, we did a trawl of the literature from all over the world, what was proven to be good and useful, and what was dodgy. And we've put together advice on that basis. So it's research-backed advice and suggestions that we know work. And you will find on every single page an activity that is appealing to children. When I do them with them, I find children say, "Oh, can we play that again? Can we play that again?" And they don't want to, they'd rather stay in for their playtime than they would and play the game again, than they would go outside, really. So yeah, they're very appealing and meaningful, and it's all about making sense and building in that journey from the concrete to the abstract, to pictures you might draw of it, to the symbolic world of mathematics.
yeah, I love that. And I love that point you made about online manipulatives. We specifically send our students physical manipulatives, even though we're online, because online manipulatives still are not concrete in the way that physical hands-on materials are. It's really somewhere in between that zone of concrete and pictorial. And so unless they've had that concrete experience, we find they still don't necessarily internalize and retain the material in the same way as if we didn't send them the physical manipulative. So that's still important even in our online setting.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think the fractions book does that similarly. We start off with easy fractions, the common fractions, a half, a quarter, an eighth, and then we look at thirds and all the fractions through to 13ths. We look at mixed numbers right from the get-go. So 1, 1.5, a half, because that's what you do. That's how children come across these things. And we look at fractions arising from, and when I talk about fractions, I mean decimal fractions as well as vulgar fractions. And we talk about them arising from sharing and measuring. And so there are lots of examples there of activities that you can do that involve sharing and measuring. Lots of toys involved. Penguins and fish fingers is one of my favorites.
I'm excited to check it out. What are some of your other resources we can point people towards? I know you have a lot on enriched maths.
Yes. Oh, there's a huge amount there. I mean, that it's very definitely going for the creative side. So it's about giving children things that they will find interesting and exciting, rather than covering the curriculum, whatever that might mean. Lots of good problems. They're still at it, the Enriched team, and still doing very high quality work there. The website is well worth exploring and is getting increasingly easy to navigate. They're always working on new ideas. There's also some very good stuff there on early years and things you might do with young children at home as well as in a learning setting, if you like.
Yeah, I saw some good things there for that. I feel like sometimes here, because we have Common Core, people almost expect math to start at 5 in those core standards. And sometimes the standards before that are missing that kids are learning or learning in preschool. And so for kids who need intervention, there's almost this gap of knowing what the standards are between when they come to school and when they start formal education. So it's always great to find.
Well, one of the strongest resources that for that, actually elaborating what those steps are, is Clements and Sarama's work and their learning trajectories.
Yes,
and those are fantastic. Really good resource. And that's also elaborated in another group that I belong to, which is the Early Childhood Maths group, which they've got a website and loads of resources there that are being developed all the time. And that for that preschool learning, that is, and that again, that early childhood maths stuff is research based, not written by experts, in their spare time for free, for love of the subject, basically.
Yeah, we'll have so many things we can link to. That website that you talked about, the learning trajectories, that is a really great one too, to look at the progression of counting and see examples of kids from young ages learning to count and see the stages broken out. And it gives ideas of what to do if kids are at one stage and you're moving them to another. So that's a great resource. Well, I think we're pretty close to wrapping up. Is there anything else that you really wanted to share with us today?
No, just thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. It's always a pleasure to talk with people who are enthusiastic about mathematics, and that's why I'm still working, whatever that might be.
Awesome. We feel the same way. Yes. And we'll have to send you a copy of our book because we found that some of the things we talked about, we put in our book that we wrote without knowing you had talked about it. And so we're curious to see what you think. But we use a lot of the Hungarian 10 frame and systematically working through numbers and the sixness of numbers. So we're excited to share it with you. So Jenni, we like to end with a math joke or pun because we feel like it's important to bring the fun into math here. So do you have a math joke you could share with us?
I do, and it is, why was 6 scared of 7?
Why?
Because 7, 8, 9.
That's cute. That's a good one. That's fun.
Last thing we want to hear is if someone's curious about your work and they want to connect with you, where should we send them?
I think if you Google Jenni Back primary mathematics, you'll get quite a bit.
Okay, great. We will connect to those things so people can find you quickly.
Thank you very much.
So much for being here. It was a delight. And we hope you continue to find ways to get involved with mathematics, even though you're retired.
Well, thank you. Thank you both for the opportunity. A pleasure to talk to you.